All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Wednesday session for 535 Intergovernmental Relations. We've got probably about half the folks in so far, and I'm sure we'll have more who will be joining us very soon, but it is 6 o'clock, so, I always try and be punctual with these Zoom sessions, and since you are here at 6, I think we should get going. So again, welcome. It was really nice seeing everyone on Saturday. Hopefully we answered all your questions about the syllabus as well as about the course and the course requirements. As always, if any questions emerge about the syllabus or course requirements, you always can email me and I'm more than happy to respond to any of your questions. Before we get into our background and foundations of intergovernmental relations tonight, which is our primary topic for the evening, just a couple of quick reminders. I know most folks have already signed up for an article for the discussion leader assignment. If you have not signed up for an article yet, please do that as soon as possible. Send me an email with your article choices and I'll try and give you the top choice that you provide for me in the email if it's still available. Now, there aren't a whole lot of articles left to choose from. I think we have maybe 4 or 5 that are unaccounted for. So you don't have a whole lot of articles to choose from, but if you haven't already picked an article, please send me an email so we can get you signed up as soon as possible. If you haven't signed up yet and you want to know which articles are still available, the spreadsheet is available on our Beachboard site. Beachboard is kind of wacky whenever sometimes you upload Excel files, and when you look at the inline viewer, they tend to look like PDFs and it kind of automatically converts them to PDFs. But if you download the link, if you click on the link, download the file, it will download as an Excel spreadsheet for you. And then you can see which articles have not yet been selected. And you can also then see when those article discussions will happen, as I have all the dates listed there as well. So if you haven't signed up yet, please do that as soon as possible. The second reminder is about the first discussion board post. Remember, I made a slight change in that I'm grading the first 5. All of the first 5 will be graded. So that includes this week 1 discussion board post where you will tell me 2 things you would like to get out of this class, 2 things you would like to learn from this class, and then respond to 2 of your classmates. That will be a graded post. So the first 5 are graded. Then the 6th post is going to be optional. And if you don't like one of your first 5 grades, you can always do the 6th one on Homeland Security and then substitute the grade on number 6 for whichever grade you want to substitute for from your first 5. If once you get through all 5 of the discussion board posts and you're very happy with your grades in all 5, then you don't have to do number 6 and you're in good shape. So the one for this week, again, will be graded. Please do finish up all your posts by Sunday at midnight, which I guess is the 26th at midnight. And I will go through and provide grades and provide feedback on those. My feedback for the discussion board posts will be kind of similar to the feedback you got in the organization theory course. Won't be a lot of feedback, but I will provide a couple of sentences here and there just to give you a little bit of feedback on how you're doing on discussion board postings. So please have your initial post as well as responses to 2 classmates. Have those 3 posts all done by midnight on Sunday. Again, the way in which I will grade those is I will assign 10 points to your initial response to my prompt, and then 5 points assigned to each of the responses to classmates. So a grand total of 20 points for each week for your discussion board participation. I think those are the only 2 reminders that I have for you tonight. After you've had a chance to review the syllabus and digest the syllabus since Saturday, does anyone have any questions about the course or any of the course requirements before we get going tonight? And let me make sure we're recording. We are recording. Just like with the 660 class, all these sessions will be recorded, and I will provide the recording on our Beachboard site. So if you miss anything tonight, or if there's any week where you're not able to attend the Wednesday night session, you'll always have that recording available to you. Okay, well, seeing no questions, let's go ahead and get into the substantive material for the evening. And I don't anticipate that we'll be here for 3 hours tonight. At least I hope we won't be here for 3 hours tonight. But what I would like to do is just get started with some of the background and foundations of federalism and intergovernmental relations. So I'll go through some slides, and these slides are available to you on our Beach Board site. And once we get through this discussion, then we'll take a break. And then after our break, we'll come back and we'll go through the United States Constitution, because I know there aren't many opportunities for you throughout your undergraduate career to have had the opportunity to go through the Constitution. Granted, if you were a political science major and you took American national government, that may have been a component within that course, but I do think it's good for us in intergovernmental relations to go through the Constitution, see what the Constitution says about the balance of power between federal, state, and local governments, as well as the balance of power between governments and citizens. I'm not going to take it all the way back to Hobbes and Locke and do all of that with you, but I do think it's important that you know kind of where the Constitution comes from, what the Constitution says, and how the Constitution frames these relationships between people and their government, as well as between the three different levels of government in our system of American federalism. So let's go ahead and start talking about some key terms that we really need to understand before we can really do a good job of discussing federalism and intergovernmental relations. And these first two terms that you see on the screen, constitutional federalism and intergovernmental relations, I mentioned those two terms in our Saturday session. Constitutional federalism speaks to the relationship between national and state governments as that relationship is embodied within the U.S. Constitution. As we mentioned on Saturday, local governments do not have a role to play in the national Constitution. In the Constitution, we only speak of two levels of government: national government and state governments. As you read the Federalist Papers that are assigned for this course, and we'll get into those Federalist Papers a little bit more next week, but as you read the Federalist Papers, you'll see Hamilton, Madison, and Jay talk about federal and state governments, or national and state governments, without a whole lot of attention to local governments. So when we talk about the term constitutional federalism, we are talking about what the Constitution says about the balance of power and the roles of national and state governments, only those two levels. When we start to introduce local governments into our conversation, that's when we move from the term constitutional federalism to this term intergovernmental relations. And as I told you on Saturday, when I first took a class like this in my doctoral program, back then it was actually called federalism, and it's remained that way for many, many years. That course has now been renamed. It's now intergovernmental relations. This course, the PPA 535 course, before I arrived at Long Beach, was called federalism, and then the name got changed to intergovernmental relations to try and reflect the growing prominence of local governments and how important local governments are in our system of American federalism. So when we talk about three levels of governments that include local governments, we're talking more about intergovernmental relations as opposed to constitutional federalism. Now, that being said, I tend to use federalism and intergovernmental relations kind of interchangeably in this class. And the reason I do that is that we kind of assume that local governments will have a role to play. Local governments have become so prominent. There are so many local governments. There are tens of thousands of local governments across the country. Local governments do a lot of the basic interaction with citizens. A lot of that direct administration tends to be done by local governments. And more today, local governments have been given a seat at the bargaining and negotiating table when it comes time to create these policies and then write the regulations for how policies will be implemented, kind of put that flesh on the bones for how we're going to implement those policies. So given that pronounced role of local governments, we really are much more in a world of intergovernmental relations as opposed to strict constitutional federalism. But that kind of begs the question as to why local governments were not included in the original Constitution. Why the framers did not see fit to include local governments in that originating document. Well, there are some good reasons why the framers didn't include local governments. If you think about allegiances at the time in the late 1700s, people's allegiance was basically to their state. It wasn't to the township or the area where they lived. It was their state in which they lived. Then they were much more loyal to their state and felt much more aligned with their state than they did with the national government. And because states were so important in the late 1700s, the framers are mostly concerned with trying to balance the power between state and this new national government. And many of the framers are more concerned about trying to retain state power and make sure the new national government did not become too powerful. So there wasn't a whole lot of thought about local governments. A lot of local governments didn't exist in the late 1700s, at least not in an official type of capacity. So I think that's one reason why we don't see local governments come into play a lot in the original Constitution. So since local governments did not really get embodied in the original Constitution, local governments don't really enjoy constitutional protection per se. So if a local government has a complaint about the federal government, that the federal government is overstepping its boundaries in terms of its power, it's difficult for those local governments to really find a constitutional mooring for their argument because they're not really included in the Constitution. Over the years, the interpretation of local governments has been that local governments are creatures of the state. And this is what's known by the third term on the screen, Dillon's Rule. Dillon's Rule dates back to an Iowa judge, John Dillon, who promulgated this rule in the case. And Dillon says in Dillon's Rule that local governments are creatures of the state. Local governments are created by state governments. Local governments are empowered by those state governments. And the natural extension of that argument is if state governments create local governments, state governments can also then choose to destroy local governments. So they are fully and completely creatures of the state that created them. The only real constitutional provisions that local governments can hang their hats on will come from the state constitution. So if state legislators or if voters in a state decide to give certain powers and certain protections to local governments, they will do that in the form of the state constitution as opposed to the national constitution. Now we see Dillon's Rule play out a lot. To give you one quick example here in California. Here in California, we have this charter rule type of provision whereby local governments, if they meet certain population requirements and population density requirements, they can become charter governments, which means that they can form basically their own constitution. And that charter, that constitution will then give them more flexibility in things such as how they run their elections, how they budget their resources, how they hire employees, and they get a lot more flexibility as one of these types of charter governments. Well, whether or not you can become a charter government will be dependent upon the characteristics and the criteria established by the state. Whether or not you can incorporate as a city will be established by state law and the state constitution. And at times we have seen the state actually come in and try and take city status away from some local governments. A few years ago, there was a very contentious debate in Sacramento about the city of Vernon. And as you know, Vernon is a very industrialized area. You don't have a lot of residents in Vernon. You have more businesses and industry. And so the state was concerned about Vernon being a city because it really didn't have the population density requirement it needed in order to incorporate as a city. Even more recently, Yurupa Valley, there have been some rumblings in Sacramento about stripping Yurupa Valley of its city status because of a variety of different reasons. But states can do that. They can create local governments, they can destroy local governments, they can empower local governments, they can order local governments to do certain types of things. That's all under this age-old provision known as Dillon's Rule. So local governments look to the state constitution and state laws for protection as opposed to the federal constitution. A fourth term that we really need to get a handle on to understand intergovernmental relations in this class is this correspondence principle. The correspondence principle in intergovernmental relations says that decision-making should correspond with the impact of those decisions. So if a local jurisdiction is going to be impacted by this policy decision, then under the correspondence principle, that local government should be having a seat at the decision-making table. It should be able to participate in that decision-making because it is the government that is most likely to be impacted by that decision. There's a fiscal correspondence principle as well, a fiscal kind of component to this correspondence principle. The fiscal correspondence principle says that those governments that are most affected should also be those governments that pay for those types of programs. So what we're trying to do with either the correspondence or the fiscal correspondence principle is we're trying to link up decision-making on a policy with those who are most closely impacted by that decision when it is made. There should be a correspondence between impact and participation in decision-making. When you're saying local governments that are impacted the most by this decision should be allowed to participate in that decision, you are talking by definition about decentralization. You're saying we should decentralize decision-making outside of Washington, D.C., and include these local governments in the decision-making process. Subsidiarity, your fifth term there on the screen, also argues for decentralization. Subsidiarity is a principle that says if a parent government is going to tell a subnational government to do something, it is incumbent upon that parent government to provide the resources for that subnational government to take that action. So if the national government is going to impose a mandate on a local government, so the EPA comes in and tells this local city, you must test for these types of particulate matter in your water, and you have to run these types of tests. Well, they're going to require them to run these tests on pollutants in their water, then the federal government should provide them the resources to pay for those types of tests. That would be this principle known as subsidiarity. If a parent government tells a subnational government to do something, it's incumbent upon the parent government to provide the resources that will allow the subnational government to do what they are told to do. We unfortunately routinely violate the subsidiarity principle here in our system of American federalism. And we don't talk a lot in this class about comparative federalism, but we do have to recognize that there are a lot of other countries in the world who also have systems of federalism. You know, Australia has a very vibrant system of federalism. Nigeria has a system of federalism. We don't talk a lot about, you know, comparative federalism systems around the world, but we do see in, for example, Australian federalism, the subsidiarity principle is much stronger there than it tends to be here in the US. Here in the US, one of the main ways that we violate the subsidiarity principle is with what all local governments hate, these things called unfunded or partially funded mandates. The federal government is very fond of imposing partially funded and unfunded mandates upon state governments. State governments have no qualms then about imposing partially funded and unfunded mandates upon local governments. Whenever you mandate a government to do something and you don't fully fund it, you are then violating this subsidiarity principle. So the correspondence principle and the subsidiarity principle both argue for a decentralization. With correspondence, it's a decentralization of decision-making. With subsidiarity, it's a decentralization of resources. Now, one term I didn't put on the screen here, but we'll still present tonight, is that term from your old economics courses called economies of scale. You're probably familiar with the idea of economies of scale, that if governments can join together, they can purchase things in bulk. If they purchase them in volume, they will get cheaper prices. So sometimes working together at a national level will provide economies of scale. It will provide us with cheaper purchasing than if we all did it individually as states or all did it individually as local governments. Economies of scale, as it pertains to federalism, argues for centralization. If we're going to pursue economies of scale, we're going to be doing things at the national level or the state level as opposed to doing things individually at the local level. So we have some federalism terms that argue for decentralization. We have others that argue for centralization. And as you'll see as we go through the course, regardless of whether we're talking about political aspects or fiscal aspects or administrative aspects of federalism, we are going to continue to return to this centralization, decentralization struggle, because the entire development of our system of American federalism has been marked by this struggle between should we centralize decision-making, should we decentralize decision-making. And we're able to have those types of debates because we have some lack of clarity in our Constitution in terms of which level of government should be doing what. And we'll explore that a little bit more as we proceed through our discussion tonight. So we know after the revolution, we needed a constitution. And again, not to delve too much into British political philosophy, but if you remember from your American government classes, you had this gentleman named John Locke, a British political philosopher from the 1600s. And John Locke is best known for his second treatise on government, in which he provides us with this idea of social contract theory. In Locke's social contract theory, as you probably already know, people enter into a contract with their government. So people retain the power. So the power emanates from the people. People can then decide to give up, to cede some of this power to government in exchange for government utilizing this power in a judicious manner to provide for the welfare of society. That's the social contract. So much like you would have in contract law, you have two parties entering into a contract and both agreeing to do certain types of things. Here we have the public entering into a contract with their government. Public gives up some of their power and liberty to the government. The government will then guarantee that they will use that power and those liberties in a judicious manner to provide for the welfare of society. That's social contract theory in a nutshell. We know that many of our framers, like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, were big fans of social contract theory. So the contract that you get between the public and their government is in essence a constitution. That's what the Constitution is. It's a contract between the people and their government. So we needed a contract. We needed a constitution. So we got our first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And you had an opportunity to look through the Articles of Confederation. I had the link provided for you on the Beachboard site. We're not going to turn this into a history class, and we're not going to go article by article through the Articles of Confederation. But we do know that there were some serious flaws in this first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. We know the Articles of Confederation created a very weak national government. Most of the power and most of the resources were retained by state governments. It was very much predicated upon this idea of states' rights. So we had the creation of a very weak national government. We also didn't really have an independent executive branch. Today in our Constitution, we're very familiar with separation of powers. And we argue a lot about should the legislature, should Congress, should the president, should the judiciary have the power on any given issue. And in the past few presidential administrations, we have seen a very contentious relationship sometimes between the president and Congress. Even when the president is from the same political party as a majority of the House or a majority of the Senate, we still tend to have this contentious type of relationship. In the Obama administration, we saw President Obama use a lot of executive orders instead of going through Congress and getting legislation. And the reason he did that is because he had a Republican-controlled Congress. And so he felt it was more expeditious to have an executive order as opposed to trying to get these things through Congress when Congress was saying, well, they're dead on arrival to begin with. That created a lot of a contentious relationship between President Obama and Republican majority in Congress. We know in the Trump administration, we also saw the Trump administration try to use a lot of executive power to circumvent the legislative function in Congress, which again caused a lot of animosity between the White House and Congress. We've seen periods of time where Congress has been at loggerheads with the Supreme Court. Congress passes a law, someone challenges the constitution of that law, it then gets heard in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finds the law passed by Congress to be unconstitutional. Congress then tries to circumvent that by amending the Constitution or perhaps revising the law to try and make it match constitutional muster or pass constitutional muster. So we've got a lot of this type of these battles going on between different branches of government. We didn't have that under the Articles of Confederation. We technically did have a president, but that president came from Congress. So Congress was really the driving force. But Congress wasn't the Congress that we think about today under our current Constitution. Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, really was predicated upon state power. So we had a unicameral Congress. So instead of having a House and the Senate, we had a one house, a unicameral Congress under the Articles of Confederation. The representatives in Congress were delegates from the states. States could recall their delegates at any time that they so chose. So if they didn't like what was going on in Congress, they could pull their delegates home. So really the power, even though we had a Congress, the power still really resided at the state level. We really didn't have a true identity under the Articles of Confederation, at least not a true national identity. And when you read through the Articles, one thing that you may have been struck by is how infrequent the use of the term United States of America is as a proper noun. The Articles refer to the United States of America capitalized as a proper noun when the Articles refer to the name of the Confederation. It says the style, which means the name, of this Confederation shall be the United States of America, proper noun, capitalized. Throughout the rest of the Articles, whenever we refer to the United States, we refer to it as the United States in Congress assembled. And typically, Congress was oftentimes not capitalized. So we're saying we are a country, we are the United States, when the states are assembled in this Congress. Now, Congress, when we think about Congress today, we think about the buildings. We think about Capitol Hill, and we think about the Capitol itself. We think maybe about the Rayburn Building and these physical buildings that make up Congress, permanent buildings. The way in which the word Congress is used in the Articles by the framers at the time was as a meeting. So a Congress is a meeting. So right now, tonight, we are having a Congress of PPA 535. We're having a meeting of PPA 535. So when they said United States in Congress assembled, they basically meant we are the United States when Congress is meeting and the state delegates are in this meeting of Congress. So it's a much different interpretation of national identity under the Articles than what we ended up with in the much stronger enunciation of national power in the Constitution that we have today. The Articles of Confederation referred to this confederation as a firm league of friendship. It's a firm league of friendship between the states. Again, not exactly a strong pronouncement of national power or unity. It was a firm league of friendship that was meant to secure our safety. It was meant to provide for the safety of the colonies. That was the primary goal of the Articles of Confederation. We would support, states would support each other in order to try and keep each other safe from foreign invasion or from insurrection. So we really didn't have a national government per se in the Articles of Confederation. Also, another major flaw in the Articles of Confederation is if we saw a problem with the Articles, in order to amend the Articles, we needed to have a unanimous vote of all 13 states. So all states had to agree before we could amend the Articles. Now, that's a serious problem because you may have these fatal flaws in your Articles of Confederation. If you need a unanimous vote of all the states to fix those flaws, good luck getting that unanimous vote. So it made it very difficult to even correct the flaws that were embodied within the Articles, even though we saw a lot of these flaws very quickly after the Articles were drafted. So there was an undercurrent of sentiment among many people that the Articles were not really sufficient for what we needed to function as a united government. Now, for all of you who are history majors, you're probably aware of the significance of this event known as Shays' Rebellion. So does anyone remember from your undergraduate or high school even history classes, what was Shays' Rebellion and why was Shays' Rebellion important?
Wasn't Shay a revolutionary soldier that was not getting his pension paid by Congress, or right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, it was a former Army captain, Daniel Shays. He had fought in the Revolutionary War. He was a farmer now. And like many of his Revolutionary War colleagues, they were not having their pension paid. We had fiscal problems, and there wasn't enough money to go around, basically. So they weren't being paid their pension. Shay, along with many other farmers in the Boston area in Massachusetts, they had these farms, and so they needed to purchase goods from merchants in Boston. So they purchased these goods based upon credit. So the merchants in Boston gave them credit because they didn't have the money to pay. So they buy all these goods and based upon credit. And then the merchants, well, they want to get their money back. They want to collect this money. They extended this credit. Now they want to get their money back. The farmers didn't have the money to pay. And so you saw a lot of foreclosures. You saw these merchants starting to take these farmers to court to demand payment. So you have this insurrection of farmers. And it's called Shays' Rebellion because it's named after Daniel Shays, but Shay was really only one of the leaders of this mini insurrection. There were a lot of other leaders as well. And it was actually it wasn't just one insurrection. There was a series of different revolts of these farmers. And the really galvanizing point of Shays' Rebellion was when Shay led a group of farmers who were, again, retired revolutionary soldiers, led these farmers to a artillery in Springfield, Massachusetts. And they wanted to raid the artillery and to get guns to help support their insurrection. The governor at the time didn't really have much of a state militia to put down this insurrection. So what he ended up doing is he put together his own private army. And he sent his own private army under the direction of a general to this artillery and told them, do not let these farmers take these guns. So they went to the artillery. And when Shay led his farmers up the hill to the artillery, the private army that the governor had put together, they were ordered to shoot over their heads. And so they fired a couple of shots over the farmers' heads to try and deter them and get them to go away. The farmers didn't stop. They kept coming toward the artillery, and so they then opened fire. And it killed a couple of the farmers, injured dozens of farmers, and obviously Shays' Rebellion then retreated. The governor then put out a bounty on their heads, and so Shay actually had to leave Massachusetts, and he had to go to Vermont, and that's where he lived out most of the rest of his life, was in Vermont. They passed a disqualification act where they disqualified any of these farmers who participated in this insurrection from ever holding public office again. And it really was kind of an iron fist response. A new governor then came in by the name of John Hancock. Probably heard of him before. And so John Hancock comes in as governor. And when Hancock comes in, he then offered pardons to all the farmers, including Shea, restored their citizenship, and forgave a lot of their debts, lowered their taxes, and forgave their debts. So at the end of the day, Shea went off to Vermont and lived out the rest of his life, and kind of became almost a spectacle up in Vermont, and became almost a tourist attraction where people would go and visit him and visit his farm in Vermont. But be that as it may, the importance of Shea's rebellion was that it really pointed out to a lot of folks at the time that we struggled to put down this insurrection of former revolutionary soldiers and farmers. If we struggled so much to put down Shea's rebellion, what would then happen if we were invaded again by a foreign nation? We really didn't have any type of defense. And so it really galvanized public opinion around the idea that we need to change the Articles of Confederation, which then led us to that Constitutional Convention. The purpose of the Constitutional Convention was not to come up with a new constitution. The Constitutional Convention was organized under the guise of amending the Articles. So we just wanted to make the proper and necessary changes to the Articles rather than completely replacing them with a brand new constitution. The way in which the Constitutional Convention started really led to this replacement of the Articles with the new Constitution. And I don't want to be too flippant about it, but one of the reasons why we ended up getting rid of the Articles and coming up with the brand new Constitution was the quality of the roads at the time. The delegates had to get to the convention. Roads were horrendous at the time. And so if you had rain, you wouldn't be able to get down the roads. It'd be full of mud, you would have holes in the road, and you just wouldn't be able to physically get there. The people who were able to get to the convention first were people like James Madison and some of his allies, who would be kind of the Federalist type of an approach to the Constitutional Convention. Madison and his allies were very much in favor of getting rid of the Articles and replacing the Articles with a brand new constitution. So because Madison and his allies were able to get to the Constitutional Convention first, they were able to get the ball rolling toward a new constitution, so that when the anti-federalists finally then started to arrive, it was already too late. I mean, the horse was out of the barn. The ball was rolling downhill, whatever cliche you want to use. Madison and his allies had already gotten the ball rolling toward replacing the Articles with a new constitution. What Madison had to do, and Madison's primary goal, was to convince the states' rights supporters, the anti-federalists, that they wanted more out of the Constitution, wanted more out of the Articles of Confederation than they were ready to admit. So you had some anti-federalists, people led by people like Sherman, was one of the major leaders of the anti-federalists. Sherman and his allies argued that we just needed to amend the Articles to provide us with better national security. We needed to amend the Articles so that we would have an army that could put down an insurrection like we saw in Shea's Rebellion, or put down a foreign invasion from France or from England. So they were arguing we need defense, and so we just need to amend the Articles. Madison's job was to convince the anti-federalists that they wanted more out of a constitution than just national defense. And he was really skillful in the way in which he did it, in that he was able to recognize that most of these delegates at the Constitutional Convention, they were all white, they were all male, and the vast majority of them were property owners. As property owners, in order to vote at the time, you had to be a property owner. If you were a property owner, it's much more likely that you were a creditor as opposed to a debtor. So a lot of those delegates owned property and were the ones who had kind of facilitated the Revolutionary War in terms of resources. So they had lent this money out, they were the creditors, and Madison knew they wanted to get their money back. So Madison was able to skillfully argue that even the Anti-Federalists needed a strong constitution that could get their debts repaid. So it wasn't just about defense, that was important, but there was also an economic imperative for replacing the Articles with this new constitution. Once Madison was able to get the Anti-Federalists to agree they wanted more out of a constitution than just national defense, it was essentially game over for the Anti-Federalists. And it meant that the delegates were then supportive of this new constitution, primarily authored by James Madison. There's a very interesting analysis of the Constitutional Convention produced many, many years ago by a historian named Charles Beard. And Charles Beard wrote a book called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And in that book, Beard argued that the delegates were there for economic reasons. The delegates were there to try and get their debts repaid. And so they were there to try and promote their individual economic self-interest. Beard's thesis was not accepted very well among the history community, and a lot of historians pushed back on that and said that that's a far too pessimistic view of the Constitution, far too pessimistic view of the motivations of the framers of the Constitution. And where the discipline of history kind of fell down on this issue is they kind of came to a consensus that, yes, there were economic imperatives, but the delegates were not necessarily there to promote their own individual economic self-interest, but rather they were there to promote their state's economic self-interest. So they were there to promote the economic self-interest of Virginia or New Jersey or South Carolina or New York and so on. But when Madison was able to show the delegates that a stronger national government could provide this type of economic benefit, then again, the ball started rolling toward replacing the Articles with this new Constitution. But the Constitutional Convention, it was fraught with a lot of disagreements. And there were three major conflicts that were going on at the Constitutional Convention. The first major conflict was the conflict between small and large states. And this conflict revolved primarily around representation. The large states, like Virginia, wanted to see proportional representation in Congress. And so you had the Virginia Plan. The Virginia Plan called for representation to be based upon a state's population. And obviously that would be something that would behoove a larger state. Then you had a small state faction. They were arguing for equal representation, that regardless of population, every state should have equal representation in Congress. That was the New Jersey Plan. So the Virginia Plan versus New Jersey Plan, we come up with a compromise known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise creates a bicameral Congress. House of Representatives, representation based upon proportional representation based upon population, and a Senate based upon equal representation, 2 senators from each state, regardless of population. So we dealt with this large state, small state controversy through a compromise. And that's going to be the trend throughout the entire Constitutional Convention. Then our second major area of conflict was between slave states and non-slave states. And we really kind of need to qualify this a little bit in that it's not as easy as just saying it's a slave state or a non-slave state in the late 1700s. Even states that we would normally consider to be non-slave states like New York, residents of New York, still many of them engaged in slavery. It's just they engaged in slavery in a much smaller scale than their counterparts in southern states like Virginia and South Carolina. The way in which northern states tended to engage in slavery was that slavery was basically used for house servants. And so slaves were then working within houses, a small number of slaves, maybe a small staff of 4 or 5 for your more affluent New Yorkers. Contrast that to places like Virginia, where they had mega plantations. Montpelier, which is was Madison's plantation, had over 1,100 acres. Monticello, Jefferson's had even larger amounts of acreage than that. You literally had hundreds upon hundreds of people being enslaved to work on these mega plantations. So the scale of slavery was much larger in what we call the quote unquote slave states as opposed to the quote unquote non-slave states. Slavery was really the backbone of the economy in those southern states. And so for southern states, slavery was a major issue for them at the Constitutional Convention. Again, the way in which the framers dealt with the slavery issue was through compromise. And they dealt with it through compromise instead of eliminating such a morally reprehensible type of institution. They decided instead to tolerate it. And a great example of that is James Madison. Madison at the Constitutional Convention referred to slavery as America's original sin. He called slavery morally, politically, and legally reprehensible, but yet he owned slaves on his estate in Montpelier and was willing to allow slavery to continue in order to get this Constitution agreed to at the Constitutional Convention. One thing that Madison was able to do is he was able to keep the property owning part of slavery out of the Constitution. A lot of people, delegates from slave states, wanted specific provisions in the Constitution speaking to the right to own slaves, basically as property. And Madison fought against that and kept it out of the Constitution. Others like Hamilton also were much more in line with abolitionists and fought against slavery as well, into putting that in the Constitution. But the compromise that they were all willing to accept, Madison, including also Hamilton, was this 3/5 compromise. And we know the 3/5 compromise was put in the Constitution to kind of ameliorate some of the concerns that we saw southern states have in terms of representation. So someone who was enslaved for the purposes of representation would count as 3/5 of a free person. That was the compromise they saw fit to put in the Constitution to get the Constitution agreed to. Another compromise they had in terms of slavery was prohibiting the banning of the slave trade until at least 1808. So they essentially took this issue and instead of resolving it, felt compelled to punt it to a future generation. So whereas with the small state, large state disagreement, they were able to come up with a well-crafted compromise. With the disagreement between slave and non-slave states, they obviously came up with what we would obviously look upon today as being a morally reprehensible type of compromise. But that is the compromise they agreed to in the Constitution. And then the third conflict was a conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists believed in the need for a strong national government. So we need a stronger national government to provide national defense, to, like Hamilton talked about, provide for an economic system that could help repay debts and could help people get out of owing all these debts, and to help us compete with trade with our European counterparts. We needed that from a stronger national government. Anti-Federalists were very much states' rights advocates, and they liked the state power that was embodied in the Articles of Confederation, and they feared that creating a strong national government would erode some of that state power. And also, to be quite honest, some of these Anti-Federalists were, again, from slave states. They were concerned that if we had a strong national government, they would then lose their ability to influence Congress, and Congress would then eventually eliminate slavery, which they saw as being an economic catastrophe for their economy in those southern states. As you read through the Constitution, you will see a series of compromises in the Constitution that are meant to try and balance the concerns of Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, obviously, for the most part, win the day in the Constitutional Convention. because the national government that's created in this new constitution looks nothing really like the one that was kind of created in the Articles of Confederation. Now we have an independent national government, a national government that has the ability through Congress to raise armies and navies, to issue taxation, to pull money from the treasury and appropriate money to spend on things, to create post offices, all these new powers that are then given to the national government. One really interesting aspect of the life of James Madison is that the Constitutional Convention, Madison was a Federalist. He argued for this stronger national government, but then after the Constitutional Convention and after he wrote the Federalist Papers, years later, when he became Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson, he became a Democratic Republican and became more of an anti-Federalist, and then started arguing later in life for more power for states as opposed to the national government. So he kind of flipped his political philosophy between the Constitutional Convention and his later political career. We can talk a lot more about the framers and some of their motivations of the Constitutional Convention, but for our purposes here for this class, we just need to understand why we end up getting the Constitution we got as a replacement to the Articles of Confederation. But even after the Constitution was written and the primary author of the Constitution was James Madison, he really gave us kind of the structure of that Constitution. The Constitution then had to be ratified before it would go into effect. And we know from Article 7 of the Constitution, we needed to have 9 out of 13 states to ratify the Constitution before it would go into effect. We got those states to ratify it relatively quickly. You can see on the screen in 1787, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. Those 5 states all ratified the Constitution in pretty quick order. The following year in 1788, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and Virginia, 5 additional states, all ratified the Constitution. But you notice the primary state that's missing from that list is the state of New York. And that was a major problem for the framers. The framers had states like Pennsylvania and Virginia and Massachusetts and some of these larger states, but they didn't have New York. Without New York, they essentially had nothing, because New York was the linchpin of commerce in the colonies at the time. And you kind of think about how trade flows. A lot of trade is flowing into the port of New York. And so it's going to go through New York before it goes off to the other states. If New York wasn't playing ball with this new Constitution and didn't want to be part of this new government, then the new government really was not going to be able to function. And so in order to get the citizens of New York to support this new Constitution, that's where we end up getting the Federalist Papers. And you're familiar, I'm sure you've read some of the Federalist Papers before. We're going to read 2 or 3 of the Federalist Papers in this class. The Federalist Papers is a collection of 85 different essays that were written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. Primarily by Alexander Hamilton, he wrote 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers. James Madison wrote 29 of them, and John Jay wrote 5. Jay wrote some of the earlier papers and then fell ill and wasn't able to write anymore. So Hamilton, and to a little lesser degree, Madison, then kind of picked up the writing from there. The purpose of the Federalist Papers, again, was to try and convince citizens of New York and all those individuals and groups who were hesitant to support this new Constitution that the new Constitution would not create too strong of a national government, and that state and individual rights would be preserved. Now, when the Federalist Papers were written, they were written by these 3 gentlemen, but originally we didn't know who was writing what. And it took us a while to figure out who wrote which Federalist paper. All the Federalist Papers were signed with Publius, which is why the major journal today in federalism is called Publius, the Journal of Federalism. They signed them each Publius, published them in major newspapers to convince the citizens of New York. When you read through the Federalist Papers, you can see the differences in the writing style, and it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly which ones are written by Hamilton, which ones are written by Madison. A few years after the articles, the Federalist Papers were written and came out in newspapers, Hamilton then compiled them together and published a compilation of the articles as Federalist Papers. Madison, a few years after that, put together his own compilation of the Federalist Papers with a few changes and corrections here and there. And that's how we ended up with the Federalist Papers. In addition to the Federalist Papers, though, the Anti-Federalists were not quiet. So the Anti-Federalists wrote their series of essays objecting to the new Constitution and the creation of this strong new national government. And I mentioned this on Saturday, but some of the Anti-Federalist papers were written by people like George Clinton, Robert Yates. They also wrote under pseudonyms, and so they would sign them Brutus or they would sign them Cato. But again, we pretty quickly learned who those individuals were. Those essays were then again published sporadically in newspapers of the time and became kind of known as the Anti-Federalist Papers. They were never really compiled together like the Federalist Papers were, and they don't really have the same acclaim today as the Federalist Papers because kind of to the victor go the spoils. And so the writers of the Federalist Papers won. They got New York to ratify the Constitution. The Constitution's still with us today. The Anti-Federalists who opposed Constitution lost, and so therefore the Anti-Federalist Papers are not really covered very heavily in federalism classes, but they were there, and there was a strong contingent of people who opposed the new Constitution and the new national government. In addition to the Federalist Papers, then, James Madison wrote the Bill of Rights. So he wrote the first really 11 amendments to the Constitution. The 11th one didn't get ratified right away. So that's why we have a Bill of Rights of 10 amendments, written by James Madison, and again, written for the purpose of trying to convince New Yorkers and others who were concerned about this new Constitution that it would not create too strong of a national government. And we'll go through the Bill of Rights as we go through the Constitution. But again, they had to work very hard in order to convince people to support this new government and this new Constitution. So what do we get with this Constitution? Again, we got a Constitution that is made up of a series of compromises. And it's a series of compromises that sometimes have conflict involved. Whenever you have a compromise, there's going to be some conflict. Compromise is one of the ways in which we deal with conflict. To throw it back to organization theory, Mary Parker Follett told us that there are 3 different ways to deal with conflict: domination, compromise, and integration. Well, we dealt with in the Constitution through compromise. So we fragment power between different levels of government, federal and state, and we also fragment power across executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So a horizontal separation of powers and a vertical separation through our system of federalism. Some parts of the Constitution argue for centralization of power. Some parts of the Constitution argue for decentralization of power. So if you look at something like, and we'll go through the Constitution, look at this specifically, but if you look at something like Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 8 addresses the powers of Congress. In Article 1, Section 8, we enumerate powers of Congress. And by enumeration, we mean we are listing the powers of Congress. Now, it may not sound commonsensical, but whenever you enumerate powers, you are by definition limiting those powers. Now, you are saying, here are the specific powers that Congress has. By saying, here are the specific powers that Congress has, the implication is, if a power is not mentioned, then that power does not belong to Congress. So by enumerating powers, you are limiting the power of the national legislature. But at the end of Article 1, Section 8, you have this elastic clause, this necessary and proper clause that says Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in Congress. That necessary and proper elastic clause is a huge grant of power to Congress. So on one hand, we limit the powers of Congress. On the other hand, we grant Congress pretty much unlimited power with that elastic clause. Again, a conflict. In Article 6 of the Constitution, we lay out the supremacy clause, saying that the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States are the supreme law of the land, meaning that when a national constitution comes into conflict with the state constitution, the national constitution wins. When national law comes into conflict with the state law, the national law wins. That's the supremacy clause. Again, centralization, strong pronouncement of national government power. Contrast that to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, the Reserve Powers Amendment, that says that all powers not vested in Congress are then retained and reserved for the states and or the people. Strong pronouncement that if it's a power not given to Congress, then that power belongs to the state. So you can kind of see these compromises have given us competing provisions that has created fertile ground for our arguments about which level of government should do what in our system of American federalism. So let's talk about that. What level of government does what? What level of government has power to do what versus other levels of government? So as we have interpreted the Constitution over the years, and as the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution, the national level has powers such as the coining of money. Only Congress may coin money. The national government has the power of treaty making. The president can enter into a treaty, and that treaty is then subject to confirmation by the U.S. Senate, by the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. The regulation of interstate commerce. This is one of those enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. When you read through Article 1, Section 8, this regulation of commerce power seems pretty simple and pretty innocuous. But this is what's come to be known as the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, that Congress may regulate trade between the states. This Commerce Clause is the clause that Congress has used over the years to greatly expand its power and domain over state government. So it's actually an incredibly important provision. Congress has the power to raise an army and a navy. Congress has the power to declare war. If the president wants a declaration of war, they have to go before a joint session of Congress to get that declaration of war. And you can only have Congress actually declaring a war. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean the president cannot use military capabilities and cannot send the military into different parts of the world. But to truly have a declaration of war, the president must go before Congress and ask for that declaration of war. We saw that in World War I, and we saw that in World War II. In World War I, there were actually several no votes for a declaration of war. For World War II, there was only one no vote. That one no vote was a representative by the name of Jeannette Rankin. And she also voted against World War I. She had been in Congress for a very long time. But Congress declares war. Congress can issue patents. Congress has the power to admit new states to the Union. So a couple of years ago, there's a lot of clamor here in California about California is so big, we should divide California up. We should divide California up into 3 different states. Well, that's all well and good. And you can put that on the ballot and have Californians vote on it. But even if Californians vote to split themselves up into 3 different states, those 3 different states cannot be admitted to the Union without the agreement of Congress. Congress has that power in the Constitution. And then, of course, this necessary and proper clause we talked about before can make all laws necessary and proper to carry into execution all those enumerated powers listed in the Constitution. So what powers are then left to states? States have the power to create local governments. Again, Dillon's rule that we talked about earlier. States have the ability to regulate trade within their states. So interstate trade is regulated by Congress. Intrastate trade within the state is regulated by the state. States have the ability to conduct elections. Now, this is an interesting one that has been in the news a lot lately. And we have seen different attempts over the years to have the federal government limit the ability of state governments to engage in elections. Sometimes the limitations have been certainly worthwhile. They have certainly been very virtuous, such as the Voting Rights Act and requiring that certain areas in southern states, before they can change their elections, they have to get the approval of the national government. The creation of supervisors to go in and supervise elections to make sure that no one is being disenfranchised or no one's being discriminated against. So sometimes the federal government has come in and limited state government ability to conduct elections for, again, virtuous and very worthwhile reasons. In recent years, we have seen the federal government really get involved in trying to regulate state elections to more or less try and arrive at the outcome they want to arrive at. But overall, states still retain the ability to govern their own elections. States have the ability to ratify amendments as we go through the Constitution. We go through Article 5. We'll talk about the different ways in which the Constitution can be amended, but there is always a role for state governments to play in ratifying amendments. And then obviously the 10th Amendment, the Reserve Powers Amendment, that they get all the powers not explicitly given to the national government in the Constitution. National and state governments also then share some powers, and so there's some overlap between their powers. Taxation. The national government uses taxation, state governments use taxation. National government relies upon the income tax. State governments also use the income tax, many of them, but many of them use sales taxes as well. Some use property taxes, but they both have the ability to levy taxation. They both have the ability to borrow money, and we are all painfully aware of that. The national government borrows a lot of money, which leads to our very large national debt. State governments also borrow money, and so this is a power shared by both. The creation of courts. When we'll read through the Constitution, we will see that in Article 3 of the Constitution, the framers created a Supreme Court. That's the only court that was created by the framers in Article 3. All courts inferior to the Supreme Court are created by Congress. So Congress set up the federal judiciary. State governments have the ability to set up their own state judiciaries, and different state judiciaries will look different depending upon which state you are looking at. And spending. National government, state governments both have the ability to spend for the general welfare of their populations. So the Constitution will lay out certain powers for national government, certain for state governments, but then some powers are certainly shared between the two levels of government. These powers and this power distribution is very dynamic in nature. And we will see throughout our discussion throughout this class just how the Supreme Court has interpreted what American federalism means. At certain points in time, state governments had the power, then the power shifted to national government. Other points in time, the national government would cede some of that power back to state governments. And our interpretation about who should have these powers depends upon the era in which we are talking, as well as the issue that we are discussing. And you'll see, I'll give you some examples as we go through the class this semester about how the Supreme Court, in the span of less than a decade, completely changed its mind in terms of national versus state power. And one example we'll talk about in the class is the National League of Cities versus Usury case in 1976 versus the Garcia case in 1985. So in the span of 9 years, the Supreme Court decided to completely reverse itself in terms of the federal government's ability to impose minimum wage requirements on state and local governments and state and local government employees. So it's a very dynamic concept, federalism is, and it's a concept that certainly has changed in interpretation over the past 200 plus years. But that's kind of what we will talk about as we move through the class. But I do think it's important for us to understand specifically what the Constitution says and what the Constitution means for our system of American federalism. So after the break, I'll pull the Constitution up and share the Constitution with you. And we'll spend some time going through the Constitution and highlighting what the Constitution says and what that then means for our study of American federalism and intergovernmental relations. And yes, I am talking a lot tonight, but that's kind of the nature of the course for tonight. So don't get used to me talking a lot because I'm going to do it tonight. But then next week, once we start getting into our articles, it'll be much more of a discussion-oriented type of course as compared to kind of the lecture that you're getting tonight. So I apologize for talking so much, but we kind of have to lay the foundation, the framework, before we can get into a discussion of all those articles we'll talk about throughout the rest of the course. So I see it is 7:10 according to my computer. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Well, yeah, let's say about a 10-minute break. Let's come back at 7:20. When we come back at 7:20, I'll have the Constitution queued up, and we'll then spend 45 minutes or so going through the Constitution, highlighting the different salient aspects of the Constitution, and again, kind of setting that framework to move forward with our discussion of articles next week. So take about 10 minutes, come on back, and we will talk about the Constitution. Okay, well, welcome back. And again, I would like to spend a few minutes now talking about the Constitution, going through the Constitution, again, highlighting some of the important elements, especially for our discussion of American federalism in this class. And then we'll call it an evening. So I think I can probably do this in about 45 minutes or so, and then give you the rest of your evening back. Next week is when we'll start getting into our article discussions, and I'll refresh your memory about which articles we're going to do next week and who has signed up for those articles once we get through our discussion of the Constitution. So let's spend a few minutes just going through the Constitution. Again, I said the Constitution is very much a series of compromises. Some compromises good, some compromises morally reprehensible, but they all do then make up the Constitution. And in order to get agreement on this Constitution, the framers felt compelled to put these compromises in to deal with some of the concerns of the anti-federalists, or deal with some of the concerns of smaller states, or deal with some of the concerns of slave-dominated states. So the Constitution is a well-organized document. It has 7 articles and then 27 amendments. So even though we made this new Constitution, or the framers made this new Constitution easier to amend than the articles, we still have only amended it 27 times. And 10 of those 27 amendments all came at once in the Bill of Rights. The 27th Amendment, which was supposed to be the 11th Amendment, written by James Madison way back in the 1790s, actually didn't get added to the Constitution until the 1990s. And so it's a kind of an interesting case, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. So what Madison did is he basically organized the Constitution around 7 different articles, each article addressing a different primary topic. So the first article deals with Congress, the legislative branch. So in Article 1 of the Constitution, he lays out for us this bicameral Congress, a House of Representatives and a Senate. That's laid out there in Article 1, Section 1. In Article 1, Section 2, we get into some of the specifics of the House of Representatives. So we know that members of the House of Representatives will serve 2-year terms. We know that you have to be at least 25 years old in order to serve in the House of Representatives. We also know you have to be at least 7 years a citizen of the United States, and you must live in the state in which you are chosen. So those are some of the basic requirements that still persist today to be a member of the House of Representatives. And I'm not going to go through everything, but just hit some of those highlights. We also know that Congress, when it does levy taxation under the original Constitution, taxation had to be apportioned according to population, called the apportionment clause. That apportionment clause has been replaced by later amendments, so you no longer have to apportion tax revenue by population, but that was part of the original Constitution. We know that members of the House of Representatives are selected through proportional representation, and so we have an enumeration whereby we count the population, determine how many representatives in the House of Representatives each state has. A few other things in Article 1, Section 2, we also lay out this idea of an office called Speaker of the House. And so that's the one congressional office that is specifically spoken of by the framers in the Constitution. So that is a constitutional office, and that the House of Representatives will have the sole power of impeachment. And we have all become painfully aware of how the impeachment process works with the two most recent impeachment efforts that occurred in the Trump administration. We know that essentially the House of Representatives, for lack of a better term in the criminal justice world, would indict a president. So they pass articles of impeachment. And then once they pass articles of impeachment, then the scene shifts over to the Senate, and then that's where the Senate holds a trial. And we've seen that happen a couple of different times in the past 3 to 4 years. In Article 1, Section 3, we set up the second House of Congress, known as the Senate. Senate's made up of 2 senators from each state. Senators serve longer terms. They serve 6-year terms. We lay out some requirements for being a senator. You have to be at least 30 years old. You have to be a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years, and you must live in the state from which you are being elected. We also know that we're going to have the Senate broken up into thirds, so that a third of the Senate comes up for re-election every 2 years. And so we have 100 senators, and so we'll have 33 coming up in 2 years, and then 33 coming up in the next 2 years, and 34 in the final 2 years. So you don't have the entire Senate coming up for re-election all at the same time, like you have over in the House of Representatives. We also know that the president of the Senate is the vice president of the United States, again, trying to get some of this balance between legislature and executive. But we also know that when the vice president serves as president of the Senate, they do not vote unless there is a tie. And that's the only time that they vote. John Adams had a very famous quote when he was our first vice president. He said, "In vice president, I am nothing, but I could be everything." And I think that kind of sums up the job of vice president pretty well. Senate gets to choose their own officers. They'll have a president pro tem. The president pro tem, in the absence of the vice president, exercises will then preside over the Senate. The president pro tem of the Senate tends to be the longest serving member from the majority party, and that's who gets to be the president pro tem of the Senate. As we said, the Senate has the sole power to try impeachments, and so the House passes the articles of impeachment, moves over to the Senate, and the Senate then holds the trial. When the trial is held, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will preside over that trial. And we saw John Roberts presiding over the last 2 impeachment trials in the Trump administration. We saw William Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice in the Clinton administration, presiding over the Clinton impeachment trial. No person who stands for impeachment shall be convicted without concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. So you only need a majority of the House to pass articles of impeachment, but you need 2/3 of the Senate in order to actually impeach the president. In impeachment cases, the judgment extends no further than removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Again, this was an important point in the last 2 impeachments in the Trump administration. If you are removed, if you are found guilty and you are removed from office, you don't serve time in jail for it. There aren't criminal penalties. You just will be removed from office and will be then disqualified from serving in future office. That, however, does not preclude charges being brought against you later on as a private citizen. So again, you don't have the immediate punitive penalties other than removal from office and disqualification from future office, but it also doesn't preclude you from facing those criminal justice types of cases in the future as a private individual. again, I don't want to spend all of our night going through all the different parts of Article 1, but just again, some of the more important ones. Each house gets to come up with its own rules of how it proceeds. The House operates a lot differently than the Senate, as you know. The Senate is a very egalitarian, collegial type of body where all 100 senators are considered to be equal in power. In the House, it's a very top-down type of relationship between members. If you're a new member, you're a backbencher, and you really don't have a whole lot of power as compared to someone who's a new member of the Senate. You have very limited debate going on in the House. You have unlimited debate going on in the Senate. For a bill to get to the floor of the House of Representatives, it must go through the Rules Committee and have a rule passed to govern how that bill will be discussed on the floor. In the Senate, it gets to the floor of the Senate through what we call a unanimous consent agreement. It gets to the floor because all senators agree to allow it to go to the floor. One senator can stand up and object to a piece of legislation and keep that piece of legislation from going to the floor of the Senate. It rarely happens. Senator Rand Paul has done it a couple times recently. Senator Hawley has threatened to do it recently as well. For the most part, it doesn't get stopped because of what we call log rolling in Congress. If you're going to stop someone else's legislation from getting to the floor, they're probably going to stop your legislation the next time you have a bill you want to get to the floor. So it's kind of this quid pro quo. I won't mess with your legislation. You don't mess with my legislation. Both the House and the Senate keep a journal of their proceedings. And so if you ever watch C-SPAN and you'll see a member of the House get up there and speak, they will usually say something to the effect of, I reserve the right to extend my remarks. That means I'm going to say what I'm going to say now, but I'm reserving the right to make changes to it and put a fuller statement into the congressional record and into the proceedings of the House. So that's what they mean when they say reserve the right to revise and extend my remarks. Compensation, the interesting thing is compensation, this clause was changed by the 27th Amendment written by James Madison, but we will get to that again in a few minutes. All revenue bills must start in the House of Representatives. The framers did this intentionally because the House was supposed to be the part of Congress that was closer to the people. The Senate was supposed to be more removed from the people. People are most impacted by increases in their taxation. So all revenue generating bills must start in the House of Representatives before they can go to the Senate. We lay out a procedure by which the House and the Senate can override presidential vetoes. We know in order to override a presidential veto, you have to have a 2/3 vote of both the House as well as the Senate. Article 1, again, there are a lot of other things. We're not going to go through all the specifics, but a really important part of Article 1, and perhaps the most important part of Article 1, is Article 1, Section 8, where we lay out the specific powers of the Congress. And again, in Article 1, Section 8, we enumerate certain powers. So we spell out specifically, here are the specific things that Congress has the power to do. Congress has the power to lay and collect taxation. We're all painfully aware of Congress's ability to increase taxation. Congress has the ability to borrow money. Again, we're painfully aware of how frequently Congress borrows money. Congress has the ability to regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with Indian tribes. This is your Commerce Clause. And again, this Commerce Clause is the part of Article 1 that Congress frequently uses to expand its power over state governments. The Supreme Court, in many different cases, has argued that for Congress to be able to require a state to do something, they must show the connection to interstate commerce. So if, for instance, Congress wants to require state governments to do background checks on firearm purchases, Congress would have to show the connection between background checks and interstate commerce. And we have a whole litany of Supreme Court cases that have required Congress to show this nexus between what they want to do and want to force states to do and how that's going to relate to the commerce between the states. So the Commerce Clause is vitally important power for Congress. To establish uniform rule of naturalization, bankruptcies, to coin money. Big controversy before the Constitution was ratified was that it was difficult for the national government to have a uniform currency. And we had different currencies being used in New York than what we had in Pennsylvania and that we had in Virginia. Different currencies means that trade is very difficult to engage in. So we gave Congress the ability to coin money, and only Congress may coin money. States are precluded from coining money. They can punish counterfeiting, establish post offices and post roads, promote the progress of science and the useful arts, so things like the National Science Foundation, funding things such as that, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. One very brief sentence that is momentous in terms of its impact. So in Article 3, we create a Supreme Court. All other courts, by tribunals they mean other courts inferior to the Supreme Court, are set up by Congress. So Congress in the Judiciary Act created the entire federal judiciary exclusive of the Supreme Court. Define, punish piracies and felonies, declare war. Again, only Congress may declare war. Congress may raise and support armies. Congress may provide and maintain a navy, make rules for the government and regulation of land and naval forces, provide for calling forth the militia. Remember in our early years, our defense was from state militias, and we really did not have a standing army for several years. And so it was these state militias that Congress had the ability to call forth. To provide for organized army and discipline the militia, exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over a district. Again, we get to our the creation of the District of Columbia eventually. To make all laws necessary and proper. Here's your elastic clause. Make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So we spend most of Article 1, Section 8 talking about the specific powers we are giving to Congress. And then at the end, we provide Congress with this elastic clause. They can make all laws necessary and proper to help them carry into execution all those powers we gave them earlier in Article 1, Section 8. So this is your statement of centralization. This is your statement of the prominence, if you will, of the U.S. Congress in terms of its power. It can make all these laws that are necessary and proper. Who determines what's necessary and proper? Well, initially Congress will determine what is necessary and proper, subject to review by the Supreme Court. Article 1, Section 9, we place certain limitations upon Congress. And so again, we have the prohibition against any laws banning the slave trade until at least the year 1808. We say Congress may not suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and you're familiar with the writ of habeas corpus, translates literally into to present the body. And so if someone is arrested, you can't just hide that person away and not say where they are or what they are charged with. So you cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus unless in times of rebellion or war. We saw Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War suspend writ of habeas corpus. And the argument was it was a time of insurrection and rebellion. Congress shall not pass any bills of attainder or ex post facto laws. A bill of attainder is essentially declaring someone guilty without a trial. So you can't do that. The person must first have a trial. An ex post facto law is an after the fact law. So you can't say that, well, this person did this last year when it was legal. We're going to make it illegal today, and then we're going to try them for doing it before it was illegal. That would be an ex post facto law. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. No preference given, regulation of commerce or revenue, one state over those of another. Important one here is that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. That's very important. That means that Congress cannot just take money from the Treasury and use it for whatever it wants to. If Congress is going to remove money from the Treasury and spend it on something, it must first say what that money is being spent on. That's what's called an appropriation. And in your budgeting class, you probably talked about the appropriations process. All discretionary spending is supposed to go through an appropriations process so we know how the money is being spent and what the money is being spent on. Congress may not issue any titles of nobility, so no knights or sirs or any of those good things. Section 10 then talks about some of the powers prohibited to states. States can't engage in treaty making. States cannot impose duties or on imports, lay any duty on tonnage without the permission of Congress. And so you've got some specific limitations then placed upon state governments. But Article 1 primarily sets up this bicameral Congress and in some ways limits the power of Congress, but in other ways provides a blanket clause whereby Congress can greatly expand its powers over state governments. And again, it's all a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, between large states and small states, and between slave states and non-slave states. Article 2 deals with the executive branch. So Article 2, Section 1 deals with the presidency. The president serves a term of 4 years. Originally, as you know, the vice president was the person who came in second place in the Electoral College. Thomas Jefferson made sure to take care of that and fix that because of his animus with Aaron Burr. And I don't know if you've seen Hamilton, but you see some of that play out in the musical Hamilton. Great musical, but do go into it recognizing there are a lot of historical inaccuracies, and you kind of have to do a suspension of disbelief and kind of put all those inaccuracies in the back of your mind whenever you watch it. But a lot of the musical deals with that. Each state shall appoint in a manner thereof a set of electors, sets up this electoral college. And we all know the way in which the electoral college works. The electoral college is what elects presidents. And so we have 538 members of the electoral college. In order to become president today, you need to get a majority of those. You need to get 270 electors. We lived through some of the controversies, if you will, at the Electoral College back in 2016, as well as in 2020. So you're kind of familiar with the way the Electoral College works. We have had some instances, as you know, in this country whereby no one has gotten a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. One of the more prominent examples of that was the corrupt bargain in 1824, where Andrew Jackson got more popular votes than John Quincy Adams or Henry Clay, the other two major candidates. Also got more electoral votes than both of those candidates, but did not get a majority in the Electoral College. We know if no one gets a majority in the Electoral College, the election then gets kicked into the House of Representatives. House of Representatives then decides, each state delegation getting one vote. So you don't vote individually, but you vote as state delegations. And in 1824, John Quincy Adams cut a deal with Henry Clay, whereby he promised to give Henry Clay a cabinet position if Clay would convince his electors to support John Quincy Adams. He did so. John Quincy Adams was then declared president by the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay then became a part of John Quincy Adams' cabinet, otherwise known as the corrupt bargain. So we had that as an example when no one got a majority in the Electoral College. There have been other examples as well, and some more recent ones as well that we became very familiar with. So you know how the Electoral College works. The important part for us of the Electoral College is it provides a role for state governments, and that these electors are going to come from states, and the number of electors a state has will be based upon its representation in Congress. So it's kind of a nod to state governments, and especially smaller states, to give them a more pronounced role in the selection of presidents. In order to be a president, you need to be a natural born citizen. You must be at least 35 years old. So again, we are raising the bar in terms of age to be president as compared to being a member of the Senate or a member of the House of Representatives. We lay out some of the succession of becoming president, what happens if there's a vacancy in the presidency. We lay out the actual oath, and this was an interesting one that in the Obama administration, Chief Justice John Roberts, when he administered the oath at the inauguration to President Obama, he did it wrong and he goofed up the words a little bit. And so he insisted that later on in the Oval Office that he would come to the Oval Office and administer the oath again so he could get it correct. And the reason why he was so concerned is because the Constitution is very specific about the actual oath that a president needs to take. So we actually saw the Chief Justice go back and fix his mistake back in the first term of the Obama administration. We know that the president wears many hats, and many of these hats are laid out in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. We know the president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. We know the president can't require opinions of principal officers, making him the head or she the head of the executive branch. We know that the president can appoint executive officers subject to the confirmation of the Senate. We know that the president can enter into treaties with foreign nations, subject to the advice and the consent of the Senate. So we know the president really is chief of staff, commander-in-chief, is chief executive, is chief diplomat, is chief of state, is chief legislator, because the Constitution also gives the president the ability to recommend legislation to Congress for Congress's consideration. So all those hats worn by the president are all laid out there for you in Article 2 of the Constitution. President has to give a State of the Union address. That is a constitutional requirement. Now it says from time to time. The tradition has been that the president gives a State of the Union address usually in late January of every year. The president will be invited by the Speaker of the House to come over and address a joint session of Congress. But according to the Constitution, it's time to time. And so it doesn't have to be annual, but that certainly has been the tradition. Section 4 then talks about disqualification. Again, we talked a lot about this during the Trump administration. The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Treason and bribery are pretty well defined. Other high crimes and misdemeanors, pretty ill-defined. And the framers never really defined it in the Constitution. If you read through relevant Federalist papers, you'll see that Hamilton does devote some time to talking about what the framers meant by high crimes and misdemeanors. A lot of historians will argue that the word misdemeanor is in there not for any specific purpose, but the framers knew it was an English law term, and they thought it gave some gravitas to the Constitution, and that's why misdemeanors ended up in there. Not really the type of misdemeanors that we think of today, but there's a big discussion about what we mean by high crimes and misdemeanors in terms of impeaching and removing a president from office. There's also a lot of discussion about impeachment in terms of removal and disqualification from future office. And during the last impeachment trial, some folks argued that impeachment does not have to include disqualification from future office as well. It could just be removal. And there is some precedence in the Senate to support that, in that there have been some impeachments of Supreme Court justices in the past that in which the Senate removed the person from office, but then did not go ahead and disqualify them from future offices. So those two terms, at least under Senate procedures in the past, could be separated. Now, in the last Trump impeachment trial, the Republican majority in the Senate said those two things could not be separated, and one had to naturally follow the other. So some contradiction, if you will, in terms of the way in which the Senate has proceeded on that issue in the past. But in Article 2, we set up the president as the head of the executive branch, providing the second head, if you will, of our separation of powers, our three branches. As I said, in Article 3, we set up the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's the only court that's set up, and it's set up in Article 3, Section 1. We lay out the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. We know the Supreme Court receives cases on the basis of two different jurisdictions. There's original jurisdiction, and then there's appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction would be a case that can begin at the Supreme Court level. Very few cases have original jurisdiction. It would have to be something of such immense constitutional scope, or something that is imperative that it must be decided now for the court to grant original jurisdiction. 99.99999% of cases get to the Supreme Court through appellate jurisdiction, working their way up through the federal judiciary. So working their way up through district courts, circuit courts of appeal, and then eventually arriving at the Supreme Court. But again, Article 3 is very short, not a whole lot of detail. It's basically one page, sets up the Supreme Court. So with Articles 1, 2, and 3, we now have our separation of powers. We have our legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Article 4, the framers then turned their attention to things such as full faith and credit. So there was a concern among states, especially anti-federalists, that the national government would impose itself on state laws. So the full faith and credit provision requires that every state provides full faith and credit, or respects the laws, records, judicial proceedings of every other state. So New York has to respect the laws of Virginia, Virginia has to respect the laws of Pennsylvania, and so on and so on. That full faith and credit provision is very important because, again, it kind of mitigated some of the concerns that anti-federalists had of an imposition on states' rights and state government power. Again, in Article 4, Section 3, we say that new states can be admitted, but new states have to be admitted by Congress, so only Congress can decide, and also precludes Congress from breaking states up. So Congress can't go and say, oh, California, you're too big, so we're going to break you up into 3 states regardless of what you want. Congress cannot do that. But California also can't break itself up. It has to have the agreement of Congress. And then Article 4, Section 4 is another important one, Republican government. The United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive against domestic violence. So we've got protection provided for state governments from the national government, which really satisfied the concerns of the anti-federalists and the federalists as well. But with this exchange, in that we are guaranteeing to states that they will maintain a Republican form of government. Now, we know our system is what we call a democratic republic. We're democratic in that power resides with the people, and people can participate in their own governance. As a Republican form of government, we elect representatives to go and make decisions for us. So we are guaranteeing, the national government is guaranteeing that it will respect the ability of states to elect their own representatives to make decisions for them. We're respecting this Republican form of government in every state. Again, reassurance to the anti-federalists. In the Fifth Amendment, we talk about amending the Constitution. So remember, in the Articles of Confederation, one of the primary flaws was it was next to impossible to amend the Articles. You had to have a unanimous vote of all the states to make amendments. So the framers knew we needed to have an easier process for amending this new Constitution. So the way we do it is through the creation of basically 4 different ways in which we can amend the Constitution. Now, despite the fact that we set up 4 different ways of amending the Constitution, we have only used way number 1. So we've only used the first way. That's the only way we've ever amended the Constitution. The primary way of amending the Constitution is to have an amendment proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. Now, this is important. You'll see when we read Federalist number 39 by James Madison for next week, we will see how he uses this as an example of a compromise. So there is a national aspect to amending. 2/3 of the House and the Senate will propose an amendment. That's the national part. Then the state part is ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. So it's a compromise to give the national government a role as well as giving state governments a role in amending the Constitution. So that's the first way, 2/3 proposal by the House and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. The second way it can be done is an amendment proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then that amendment gets ratified by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. So instead of having the state legislature do it, a state could hold a constitutional convention and could then have it ratified in that constitutional convention. A third way to amend the Constitution is to have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a constitutional convention. So 2/3 of the states get together and ask Congress to hold a national constitutional convention. Then any amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention then get ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. The fourth approach is 2/3 of the states get together and petition Congress for a national constitutional convention. And then those amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention then get ratified by, you guessed it, 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. Now, even though we've got those four different ways, we've only used number one. And the reason we've only used number one is arguably it's the easiest to do and the quickest, but we're also afraid of constitutional conventions. And we know what happened at the Constitutional Convention that gave us our current Constitution. Framers went to that Constitutional Convention to just amend the articles, and they ended up throwing out the articles and replacing it with a brand new and a very, very different Constitution. So as a concern, if we have a Constitutional Convention for the limited purpose of proposing an amendment, we could actually end up getting rid of our Constitution and replacing it with something else. And so because of that fear, we always just use approach number one. Proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. Then in Article 6, we talk about debts and oaths and all those good things, but definitely the most important part of Article 6 is this second paragraph. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So all national laws and constitutions and treaties are supreme. They reign supreme over state laws and constitutions. Again, that's a very significant pronouncement of national government power. So this is where the framers really put into the Constitution how powerful and how important the national government would be with this supremacy clause. Then Article 7 just talks about ratification and that you had to have ratification by at least 9 states, and we discussed how the ratification process worked before the break. So those 7 articles make up the original Constitution. But as we said, in order to get the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution, Madison had to immediately write 10 amendments to the Constitution and append these amendments in the Bill of Rights. You're familiar with most of the Bill of Rights, and so you know the First Amendment is freedom of religion, press, expression. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people to peaceably to assemble and to petition government for redress of grievances. Now, that provides or really returns power to the people. But we do recognize, and the Supreme Court has said over the years, that there are some limitations to these rights that will be tolerated primarily for the protection of the welfare of society. So religion. We have two different aspects of freedom of religion. We have establishments and we have free exercise. So the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. In terms of the Establishment Clause, your right to believe in a religion is unfettered. So you may believe in anything you want to believe in. So there are no limitations necessarily placed upon your ability to believe in a religion. Where we do place limitations is in your ability to freely exercise your religion. So if your exercise of your religion could harm someone else or could hurt public safety, we can put limitations upon your exercise of your religion. Same thing with freedom of speech. You've heard the old adage out of the Supreme Court that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That you have freedom of speech, but if you do say things that could damage or harm others or put them in harm, there can be limitations placed upon your freedom of speech. Freedom of the press. We know there are limitations placed upon freedom of the press. There essentially is not what we call prior restraint. Prior restraint is if the government could come in and stop the publication of an article because it makes them look bad. That's prior restraint. There's not a whole lot of prior restraint allowed. Now, you know, in the Pentagon Papers case, there was a claim by the government of trying to use prior restraint because they said if this was published, it would hurt the war effort and it would put American military personnel in harm's way. So at times, you know, if it's going to harm military personnel or something like that, sometimes government can slow down the publication, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of that prior restraint allowed. However, we do know that we have libel and slander laws in this country. So you cannot libel someone and you cannot slander someone. So again, that libel is a limitation upon freedom of press. Libel is written, slander is verbal. There are some limitations placed upon the right of people to peaceably assemble. If you want to hold a protest, you may have to go and get a permit to hold that protest. If you want to protest at one of the national nominating conventions, you'll have to register and then they'll put you probably in a little fenced-in pen. And that's where you get to do your protesting. So again, they do that to protect public safety. So Amendment number 1, these basic freedoms we all know and love, but we also have to recognize that there have been some limitations placed upon those freedoms to protect public safety. Second Amendment, we argue about this one a lot, the right to bear arms, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is a right that has never been fully what we call incorporated. Incorporation is a term that means when we take these limitations against government power in the Bill of Rights and we expand those limitations to include state governments as well. So the Supreme Court originally, the Bill of Rights, the Supreme Court interpreted these limitations to be limitations against national government action. Over the years, the Supreme Court has then extended those protections to include limitations against state governments as well. That process of including the limitations against state governments as well is what's known as incorporation. So when state governments have the same limitations as the federal government in a certain right or liberty, that right or liberty has been said to be incorporated. The Second Amendment has never been fully incorporated. And so the courts have tolerated state and local government restrictions on the right to own guns. That's why we have some background checks in some states. We have stricter gun laws in certain states as compared to other states. It's because of the lack of that full incorporation. A lot of controversy about the initial clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, and just how operative that clause is in terms of potential limitations for the owning of firearms. If you're, and we won't get into it, but if you're interested in that, you can read in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton actually had a few things to say about well-regulated militias and his interpretation of the Second Amendment to the Constitution. So If you want to read that, read Hamilton, and he actually is pretty forthcoming about what he thought about the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Third Amendment to the Constitution, no quartering of soldiers. This really relates to privacy rights. And so you cannot be forced to allow soldiers into your home. Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated unless you have probable cause, unless you can get a court order. You're not allowed to go in and search someone's home or search someone's possessions. Again, a privacy right. Fifth Amendment, trial and punishment. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in land or naval forces or in the militia, blah, 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 blah. No, any person shall be subject to the same offense twice, put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself or deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No double jeopardy. Double jeopardy means that you're being tried for the same crime twice. This is a good example of incorporation. Back in the 1930s, a gentleman by the name of Palco was being tried by the state of Connecticut for murder. In the trial for murder, he was found not guilty. State of Connecticut obviously didn't like the fact that he was acquitted, so they retried him. Same crime, same set of facts, tried him again, got a different jury, and got him convicted of murder. Got him sentenced to the death penalty. Palco complained to the Supreme Court. Case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. He said, this is a clear violation of double jeopardy. I'm being put in jeopardy of my life for the same crime twice. Supreme Court said, we're sorry, but it's not. Because the Fifth Amendment, your double jeopardy protections, are only protections against national government actions. You were retried by the state of Connecticut. This does not apply to state governments, so therefore you don't have your double jeopardy protections. Unfortunately for Mr. Palco, the Supreme Court didn't reverse course on that until the 1960s. And the case of Benton versus Maryland in 1968, that's when the Supreme Court finally incorporated your double jeopardy protections to include limitations on state government action as well. Since it was in the 1960s, it did no good for Mr. Palco, but it just gives you an example of sometimes how long it takes the court to incorporate these rights to include protections against state government actions. You're protected from self-incrimination, and you also are protected from being deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. This is your due process criminal justice protections. Sixth Amendment, right to a speedy trial, right to confront witnesses. We're familiar with all of that. Seventh Amendment, trial by jury in civil cases exceeding $20. Again, this kind of really puts the Constitution at its place in history, in that $20 in 1791 was a really big deal. $20 today is not nearly as big of a deal as it was back then. Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, no excessive fines, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. This obviously deals with the death penalty, and we know we have different capital punishment laws in different states because, again, this is one that has not been fully incorporated to include all state governments as well. So that's why the court has tolerated different capital punishment laws in different states. Ninth Amendment, enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Again, this paid homage to anti-federalists. This is where they're saying, okay, just because we're giving rights to the national government doesn't mean that we are taking rights away from people. And so don't think that we're denying or disparaging rights held by people. Reserved Powers Amendment, Amendment 10, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by states, nor prohibited by it to states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So if we're not giving something specifically to the national government, then those rights that are not given, those powers that are not given to the national government are then reserved to the states and or the people. Again, a nod to the anti-federalists to convince them that this national government would not be too powerful and that they should ratify this new Constitution. 11th Amendment limits the judicial power of the national government. 12th Amendment changes how we elect presidents and vice presidents, so that vice presidents are on the same ticket as the president, so you no longer have the second place finisher becoming vice president and not getting along with the president. 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, ratified in 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime wherever the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So we finally, in 1865, abolished slavery in the Constitution. 14th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1868, again, provides equal protection and provides equal protection as limitations against states. So states may not violate these civil liberties and these civil rights under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. A lot of other things there as well, but primarily it's your equal protection type of amendment. 15th Amendment, you cannot use race to bar someone from the right to vote. The right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, ratified in 1870. 16th Amendment. Sometimes today you'll hear people say, don't pay your income taxes because the federal income tax is unconstitutional. Well, that was probably true before 1913. But in 1913, we ratified the 16th Amendment. Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxation on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment. So this allowed for the direct individual income tax. So if someone tries to tell you the income tax is unconstitutional today, read them the 16th Amendment. And it's just not true. It is constitutional. And that's a very broad grant of power to Congress. They may levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportioning it according to state population. Under the original Constitution, we know that senators were not directly elected, but rather senators were selected by state legislatures. We fixed that with the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, and we make senators directly elected by the people. 18th Amendment is prohibition. So liquor is abolished in the 18th Amendment. The 19th Amendment in 1920 provides for women's suffrage. So it took until 1920 to get this provision ratified and into the Constitution. It's important to note that many states predated this in terms of their women's suffrage laws. States like Wyoming and Oregon had women's suffrage decades before the national government. I think Wyoming, if I'm not mistaken, I think their women's suffrage law dates back into the 1860s. But it took the federal government until 1920 to incorporate that in the Constitution. 20th Amendment changes the terms of presidents and Congress. In the past, presidents wouldn't start serving their term until March. Now we move that up to January and move up the beginning of each Congress to January as well. Also has some provisions for vacancies that may occur. 21st Amendment, we repeal the 18th Amendment, so we repeal prohibition with the 21st Amendment. 22nd Amendment imposes term limits on the president, so presidents then have a 2-term limit and may not serve more than 2 terms. Obviously, this was a reaction to FDR being elected to 4 terms as president. 23rd Amendment provides electoral votes to the District of Columbia. So this is why we have 538 electoral votes instead of 535, because we have 3 additional electoral votes for the District of Columbia. 24th Amendment, we outlaw poll taxes, which, as we all know, were used prominently in southern states to try and disenfranchise voters, oftentimes on the basis of race. So we got rid of poll taxes in the 24th Amendment. 25th Amendment, we clarify presidential succession and how vacancies are filled in the presidency, as well as how we handle presidential disability. So if a president is deemed unable to carry out their functions and duties as president, We then establish a process whereby the vice president, along with a majority of the cabinet, can then declare the president disabled and unable to carry out their functions, at which time the vice president would then take over the functions of the president until the president is able to then attest to Congress that the president is able to resume their duties. In addition to the vice president being able to do this with a majority of members of the cabinet, there's also a provision whereby the Congress can set up a committee, and a majority of that committee, along with the vice president, can then declare the president unable to carry out their duties. Again, that was done after the assassination of John F. Kennedy to kind of clarify what would happen if a vice president needed to take over the duties of a disabled president. 26th Amendment allowed 18, 19, 20-year-olds the right to vote. And then the final amendment, the 27th Amendment, really interesting one. No law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. In other words, Congress cannot take the benefit of a pay raise until they stand for re-election. This, as I said before, is written by James Madison in the late 1700s. It was supposed to be part of the Bill of Rights, but it never got ratified. So it sat around for 200 years before it finally got ratified in 1992. And in the 1970s, a college student wrote a paper on the viability of this amendment and made the argument that there was no sunset provision in this amendment, that there was no time at which this amendment would become inoperable, and argued in his paper that this is still viable and could be ratified by the states. Apparently his professor disagreed and didn't give him a great grade on the paper, but undeterred, he went out there and worked with some other folks and some other groups to start a movement to get this amendment ratified, and it finally was ratified in May of 1992. Again, over 200 years after Madison first wrote and proposed the amendment. So that then became the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. So as you can see, we don't amend the Constitution very often, even though the Constitution is easier to amend than the Articles of Confederation were. So we're very circumspect in terms of when we change the Constitution, when we amend the Constitution. But again, I know that we went through the entire Constitution. We didn't hit every single point in the Constitution because my goal is not to make everyone constitutional law experts. Lord knows I'm not a constitutional law expert. The purpose of this is just to give you a refresher on the Constitution, because we are going to be referring back to the Constitution throughout our next 5 weeks together as we talk about the development of federalism and the different eras of federalism we have gone through and how the Supreme Court has interpreted all these different compromises that the framers incorporated within the Constitution. So keep the Constitution. I've got it for you at our Beach Board site. So keep it as a reference, and we'll be referring back to it throughout the course. And hopefully, maybe in the future, you'll be referring to it as well in your everyday lives. So any questions at all on anything we've covered with the Constitution, or anything we cover with any of our preliminary information of how we got to this new Constitution and why we replaced the articles with the new Constitution?
None here.
Okay. It's a fun time talking about the Constitution, huh? I thought you'd enjoy it.
State ratification.
I'm sorry, what was that again?
A question about state ratification of amendments.
Sure.
So I guess I'm thinking of this specifically in terms of the Equal Rights Amendment. So is there, I think for the ERA, there was a specific time frame, but is there a process to extend that with different amendments?
Yeah, it's a good point. With the ERA, the example there is there was a sunset provision, and it became common after the late 1700s to have sunset provisions. And so what the amendment would say is, it would say, if this is not ratified by the states within 7 years, the amendment becomes inoperable. The ERA had that type of a sunset provision, and so since that that time period has passed, there could be a reintroduction of the amendment by Congress. And if it's reintroduced by Congress, then you can go back and pick up those states that had not ratified it yet. And if you get enough of those states that had not ratified it to get up to 3/4 of the states, then you could have it become part of the Constitution. But it did have that sunset provision, like all constitutional amendments have today.
Thanks.
Absolutely. That's a good question. Any other questions or anything at all, observations or anything about our discussion, or not really a discussion, my presentation of the Constitution? Again, this is an unusual class. So, don't think all the rest of them are going to be like this. We survived tonight, me talking a lot about the Constitution. Future class sessions will all be discussions. So once we get this under our belt, we get to do a lot of discussions in the future. Then for next week, we will continue our discussion of the background and foundations of American federalism. And on our agenda next week, we have Federalist number 39, which was written by James Madison. I'm going to really sound like a wonk here, but it is my favorite Federalist paper out of all 85. 39 is my favorite because of the way in which it's written. Madison wrote it to defend the Constitution. He basically goes and deconstructs the Constitution to ask the question, is this part of the Constitution national or is it federal in nature? And by federal, he means states' rights. And he goes through all these different parts of the Constitution to determine whether it's more national or more federal in nature. And again, comes to the conclusion to try and convince people that it's nothing to be afraid of and that it won't create too strong of a national government. But just the way he approaches the Federalist paper, I think is really interesting because he approaches it very much as you would as a researcher, and that he deconstructs all the different component elements. No one has signed up for Federalist 39, which is fine. I will lead the discussion of Federalist 39, and that's where we'll start next week. Esther has signed up for Federalist number 10, so she'll lead the discussion of that next week, talking about factions and Madison's opinion about factions. We'll also then discuss the Federal System article by Grodsons, and this is where I'll kind of take you through the development of federalism. We'll talk about the different eras of federalism and what those different eras meant for the balance of power between federal and state governments. Then we have the models of national, state, and local relationships by Deal Wright, and Joshua has that one. So he'll take you through that article in terms of the different theoretical models of federalism and what they mean for the balance of power between different levels of government. And then we also, I believe, have the Paradox of the Middle Tier by Martha Durthick. No one has signed up for that one as well, so if no one signs up for that before next week, I'll handle the discussion of that, in which Durthick talks about the unique role of state governments in this federal system and what it means for state governments to be the first governments, but then still be so subject to national authority as they are in today's American federalism. So those are the articles we're going to be discussing next week. So I guess we have 5 of them. So if you can read those articles before next week's class, then again, it won't be a presentation, it won't be a lecture, it will be a discussion of those articles. So I'm hoping we can really engender a good bit of participation in those discussions. Okay, that's all that I have for tonight. Just again, a reminder, if you haven't signed up yet, send me an email and we'll get you signed up for one of those articles. And another reminder is, again, to do your discussion board, both the initial post and then respond to 2 classmates. And for this one, all you're doing is just telling me 2 things that you want to get out of the class, 2 things you would like to learn from this course. For those who are leading a discussion next week, again, review the syllabus in terms of the expectations for discussion leaders. Again, it's not a presentation, it's facilitating a discussion. So if you could prepare some questions in advance for your own reference, that will help you lead that discussion. Always prepare more questions than you think you may need. The discussions usually tend to go 20 to 30 minutes or so. There's no real time limit, but I'll be evaluating them based upon how well you have generated discussion. I will always, you know me, I'll always have something to say at the end of every discussion. That's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean you didn't do a good job. It doesn't mean you missed any points or anything. but I always will add a little perspective on each of those articles at the end of each discussion. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for listening to me and me drone on about the Constitution. In future sessions, I will be able to save my voice, and I'll be listening more to you than listening to my own voice. So thanks again. Any questions emerge, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you back here at 6 o'clock next Wednesday. So take care, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
There you
Good
go.
night.
Good night.
Thank you.